Coate guessed the travelers had been together a month or so, long enough to become comfortable with each other, but not long enough to be squabbling over small things. They smelled of road dust and horses. He breathed it in like a perfume. Best of all was the noise. Leather creaking, men laughing, the fire cracked and spat, the women flirted, someone even knocked over a chair. For the first time in a long while, there was no silence in the Waystone Inn. Or if there was, it was too faint to be noticed, or too well hidden. Coate was in the middle of it all, always moving, like a man tending a large, complex machine. Ready with a drink just as a person called for it, he talked and listened in the right amounts. He laughed at jokes, shook hands, smiled, and whisked coins off the bar as if he truly needed the money. Then, when the time for songs came and everyone had sung their favorites and still wanted more, Coate led them from behind the bar, clapping to keep a beat. With the fire shining in his hair, he sang Tinker Tanner, with more verses than anyone had ever heard before, and no one minded in the least. Hours later, the common room had a warm, jovial feel to it. Coate was kneeling on the hearth, building up the fire, when someone spoke behind him. "Quoth?" The innkeeper turned, wearing a slightly confused smile. "Sir?" It was one of the well-dressed travelers. He swayed a little. "Your quoth?" "Coat, sir," Coate replied in an indulgent tone that mothers use on children and innkeepers use on drunks. "Quoth the bloodless." The man pressed ahead with the dogged persistence of the inebriated. "You looked familiar, but I couldn't figure it." He smiled proudly and tapped a finger to his nose. "Then I heard you sing, and I knew it was you. I heard you in Imre once. Cried my eyes out afterward. I never heard anything like that before or since. Broke my heart." The young man's sentences grew jumbled as he continued, but his face remained earnest. "I knew it couldn't be you, but I thought it was. Even though... But who else has your hair?" He shook his head, trying unsuccessfully to clear it. "I saw the place in Imre where you killed him. By the fountain. The cobblestones are all shattered." He frowned and concentrated on the word. "Shattered. They say no one can mend them." The sandy-haired man paused again, squinting for focus. He seemed surprised by the innkeeper's reaction. The red-haired man was grinning. "Are you saying I look like Quoth? The Quoth? I've always thought so myself. I have an engraving of him in back. My assistant teases me for it. Would you tell him what you just told me?" Coate threw a final log onto the fire and stood. But as he stepped from the hearth, one of his legs twisted beneath him and he fell heavily to the floor, knocking over a chair. Several of the travelers hurried over, but the innkeeper was already on his feet, waving people back to their seats. No, I'm fine. Sorry to startle anyone." In spite of his grin, it was obvious he'd hurt himself. His face was tight with pain, and he leaned heavily on a chair for support. "Took an arrow in the knee on my way through the Eld 3 summers ago. It gives out every now and then." He grimaced and said wistfully, "It's what made me give up the good life on the road." He reached down and touched his oddly bent leg tenderly. One of the mercenaries spoke up. "I'd put a poultice on that, or it'll swell terrible." Coate touched it again and nodded. "I think you are wise, sir." He turned to the sandy-haired man, who stood swaying slightly by the fireplace. "Could you do me a favor, son?" The man nodded dumbly. "Just close the flue." Coate gestured toward the fireplace. "Bast, will you help me upstairs?" Bast hurried over and drew Coate's arm around his shoulders. Coate leaned on him with every step as they made their way through the doorway and up the stairs. "Arrow in the leg?" Bast asked under his breath. "Are you really that embarrassed from taking a little fall?" "Thank God you're as gullible as they are," Coat said sharply as soon as they were out of sight. He began to curse under his breath as he climbed a few more steps, his knee obviously uninjured. Bast's eyes widened and then narrowed. Coat stopped at the top of the steps and rubbed his eyes. One of them knows who I am. Coat frowned. Suspects. Which one? Bast asked with a mixture of apprehension and anger. Green shirt, sandy hair. The one nearest to me by the fireplace. Give him something to make him sleep. He's already been drinking. No one will think twice if he happens to pass out. Bast thought briefly. Nightmane? Menka. Bast raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Coat straightened. Listen 3 times, Bast. Bast blinked once and nodded. Coat spoke crisply and cleanly. I was a city-licensed escort from Rallian, wounded while successfully defending a caravan. Arrow in the right knee. 3 years ago, summer. A grateful Sealdish merchant gave me money to start an inn. His name was Daolin. We were traveling from Purvis. Mention it casually. Do you have it? I hear you 3 times, Reshi, Bast replied formally. Go. Half an hour later, Bast brought a bowl to his master's room, reassuring him that everything was well downstairs. Coat nodded and gave terse instructions that he not be disturbed for the night. Closing the door behind himself, Bast's expression was worried. He stood at the top of the stairs for some time, trying to think of something he could do. It is hard to say what troubled Bast so much. Coat didn't seem noticeably changed in any way, except perhaps that he moved a little slower, and whatever small spark the night's activity had lit behind his eyes was dimmer now. In fact, it could hardly be seen. In fact, it may not have been there at all. Coat sat in front of the fire and ate his meal mechanically, as if he were simply finding a place inside himself to keep the food. After the last bite, he sat staring into nothing, not remembering what he had eaten, or what it had tasted like. The fire snapped, making him blink and look around the room. He looked down at his hands, one curled inside the other, resting in his lap. After a moment, he lifted and spread them, as if warming them by the fire. They were graceful, with long, delicate fingers. He watched them intently, as if expecting them to do something on their own. Then he lowered them to his lap, one hand lightly cupping the other, and returned to watching the fire. Expressionless, motionless, he sat there until there was nothing left but gray ash and dully glowing coals. As he was undressing for bed, the fire flared. The red light traced faint lines across his body, across his back and arms. All the scars were smooth and silver, streaking him like lightning, like lines of gentle remembering. The flare of flame revealed them all briefly, old wounds and new. All the scars were smooth and silver except one. The fire flickered and died. Sleep met him like a lover in an empty bed.